Imagine this, a young waitress, frustrated and overworked, casually insults a man she thinks is just another grumpy old diner customer. But what happens when she realizes that this old man is none other than Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor and owner of the diner? The lesson she learns from this encounter will change her life forever. Stick around until the end to find out how one mistake turned into a powerful moment of self-reflection and growth. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories you won't want to miss. The diner sat quietly on the corner of a sleepy town, its neon sign buzzing faintly in the evening air. Inside, the clink of plates and the hum of conversation provided a familiar soundtrack to the night shift. Emily, a young waitress with a touch of impatience and a lot of ambition, was hustling through her shift. She'd been working here for a few months, eager to prove she had what it took to rise above the typical diner grind. Tonight, however, was different. It was one of those nights where nothing went right. The coffee machine was on the fritz, the customers were crabby, and the clock on the wall seemed to slow down as if mocking her. She could feel the exhaustion creeping in, the weight of the day pressing down on her shoulders. But she kept moving. There was work to be done, and she wasn't one to complain. Not aloud, anyway. Her shift wasn't short on drama, and it wasn't even halfway through yet. A couple in the booth near the window argued over dessert, a regular complaining about the eggs being too runny, and the table by the door had already spilled an entire pitcher of water. Emily wiped down the counter again and again, wishing for the clock to speed up, wishing for a sign that things were going to change. Then, the door swung open, and a quiet stillness seemed to enter with him. Clint Eastwood, or rather, a man who looked remarkably like him. He wore a simple jacket, his face partially shadowed by a worn cap, but the presence he carried was unmistakable. His eyes were calm, steady, the kind that knew something the world didn't. He walked into the diner like he owned the place, maybe even more so than the actual owner. Emily, engrossed in the rush of the night, didn't pay him much attention at first. It was late, and she was too focused on getting through her shift to really take in the details. The diner wasn't a place for celebrities, after all. It was a place where the hard-working, the tired, and the hungry came to rest, no frills attached. So, she thought nothing of the man who had just entered, at least, not at first. He moved slowly, deliberately, taking in the ambience of the diner with a familiarity that didn't quite match his outward appearance. The steady gait, the calm composure, it made him seem like someone who belonged there. He took a seat at the corner booth, his back straight, his eyes scanning the menu with an air of quiet authority. Emily shook her head and refocused, trying to shake off the sense of unease that seemed to settle in her chest. She had a job to do. She wasn't here to play detective. She grabbed her notepad, took a deep breath, and approached the booth, her usual brisk, no-nonsense attitude in full swing. It was a regular shift, a regular customer, and that's all it was going to be. "How's it going?" she asked, flashing a quick, forced smile. The man didn't respond with a cheery greeting or the usual small talk. Instead, he simply nodded, his gaze fixed on the menu, as if weighing his options. A silence hung between them for a beat too long, but Emily didn't mind. It wasn't unusual for diners to prefer solitude. After a few seconds, he ordered a simple meal, nothing out of the ordinary, just a coffee and a sandwich. Emily jotted down the order. Her mind wandered for a moment, lingering on the strange stillness about him. She couldn't put her finger on it. Maybe it was his calm demeanor, the way he seemed unaffected by the chaos around him, or perhaps it was just the way he sat, poised and confident, like a man who had been through 1,000 storms without flinching. She glanced at him again, this time noticing the lines on his face, the weathered skin, the way his eyes, though soft, seemed to hold a depth that went beyond the average diner guest. Something about him unsettled her, but it wasn't fear. It was more of a quiet curiosity. With a half-joking tone, she leaned over the counter as she jotted down his meal. "Going for the typical grumpy old man vibe, huh?" She chuckled to herself as she spoke, trying to lighten the mood. She had said it before to other older customers, a casual jab, a harmless quip. Nothing to be taken seriously, just part of the job. But this time, when she looked up, she saw his eyes hadn't left hers. He didn't flinch or even acknowledge the jab with a smile or a chuckle. He simply nodded, his gaze unblinking. That moment when their eyes met, felt heavy. It was a silent challenge, like he was quietly assessing her, and for a brief second, she wondered if she might have said too much. But the thought passed just as quickly as it had come. She turned on her heel, shaking it off, trying to focus on the tasks ahead. Still, as she walked back to the kitchen, there was an odd feeling in the pit of her stomach. Something was off, and she couldn't place why. Was it the way he carried himself? Or the look in his eyes? But no, it didn't matter. It was just another night, just another customer. Tomorrow would be a new day. But somewhere, deep down, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that tonight would be different. The night crept on, slow and steady, much like the diner itself. The clink of silverware on plates, the soft murmur of hushed conversations, and the low hum of the neon sign outside filled the air. Emily continued to rush from table to table, juggling orders, wiping down counters, and trying to keep up with the constant demands of the customers. The usual faces came and went, but Clint Eastwood, or the man who looked like him, remained at his booth, as still as the night around him. Emily couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was different about him, but she tried to push it aside. After all, there were more pressing matters. The regulars were getting grumpy about their wait times, and her coffee machine was still sputtering like an old man with a bad cough. Nothing seemed to be going right, and the clock on the wall seemed to be mocking her every second that ticked by. But every time Emily glanced in Clint's direction, she noticed something strange. His calmness was almost unnerving. He didn't seem bothered by the occasional clatter of dishes or the cacophony of sounds from the kitchen. He didn't seem to notice the growing tension in the air as the night dragged on. His eyes never wavered from the menu, though she knew he'd already ordered. He wasn't like the other customers, the ones who wanted small talk or banter with their food. Clint was different, and that unsettled her more than she liked to admit. At some point, Emily found herself walking over to his booth again, this time to refill his coffee. The usual part of her job, checking in, making sure everything was okay. But there was something about Clint that made her pause as she approached. He sat there, still and quiet, like a man who had seen it all, a man who had nothing left to prove, a man who didn't need the world's approval. She stopped a few feet from the table, her eyes on his face. There was something about him, something that made her feel small in comparison. She could tell he was older, though not frail. He carried himself like a man who had spent a lifetime walking through storms, only to emerge unscathed. She felt the words coming before she could stop them, and without thinking, she said, "You know, most people your age aren't sitting here in a diner by themselves ordering simple meals." The words left her mouth before she realized what she'd said. Her usual sarcastic edge was sharper tonight. She didn't know why, but the tiredness from the shift seemed to leak into her tone. Maybe it was frustration, or maybe it was just the way he made her feel. She had spent too much of her life trying to prove herself, trying to be noticed, trying to be better. And here he was calm, unbothered, like he had nothing to prove. Clint didn't flinch. He didn't smile. He didn't even give her the slightest acknowledgement that she'd just poked at him with a sharp barb. His eyes, though still calm, seemed to look right through her. Like he saw everything. Like he saw past her defensiveness, past her sharp words, to the vulnerable girl beneath it all. She paused, unsure of how to take his silence. Was he offended? Annoyed? Or was he simply beyond it all? She busied herself with refilling his coffee, but even as she poured, she felt the weight of the moment. It was strange. She was used to banter, to the little jokes she made with the regulars, to the easy, effortless conversations that filled the hours. But Clint didn't engage in any of that. He just sat there, patient, composed, like he had all the time in the world. Grumpy old man vibe, she muttered under her breath, almost to herself. It was meant to be a joke, a way to lighten the awkwardness. But the words hung in the air, heavy, sharp. His gaze didn't shift. He didn't react at all. But there was a flicker, a brief moment where Emily felt like he might be silently evaluating her. She couldn't explain it, but it was as if she'd just said something far more important than she intended. "Is that what you think?" he finally said, his voice low, measured. Emily froze. There it was, the question. And suddenly, she realized that Clint wasn't just a man sitting at a diner. He wasn't just some old guy who didn't care. He was someone who commanded attention without saying a word. He was someone who could make you question your assumptions with a simple glance, a single sentence. Her heart skipped. She had no idea how to answer that question. Was she really judging him? Was she projecting her own frustrations onto him? She wasn't sure, but she felt something shift inside her. Maybe she had been too quick to assume. Maybe she had been too harsh. But she didn't know how to backpedal. She didn't know how to take back the words that had slipped out of her mouth so easily. So instead, she just nodded and gave him a tight smile, almost hoping the conversation would end. He didn't say anything more. He just sat there, his eyes meeting hers for one long, quiet moment. Then, with the smallest of nods, he returned to his meal, as if the conversation had never happened. But for Emily, something had shifted. The rest of the evening seemed to drag on, but she couldn't stop thinking about Clint. His stillness, his calm, his way of carrying himself like he was untouchable. It wasn't arrogance. It was something else, something deeper. And as the night wore on, Emily couldn't help but wonder if she had just made a mistake that would haunt her long after the diner closed for the night. The night wore on like a slow-moving river, with time slipping past unnoticed. Emily tried to shake off the feeling that had been gnawing at her since Clint first walked in. But the sense of unease lingered, as if something was about to shift, something big, and she couldn't put her finger on it. The diner was getting quieter now. The late-night crowd had dwindled to just a handful of regulars, nursing their last cups of coffee before heading out. Emily had long since gotten used to the rhythm of the place, the ebb and flow of customers, the predictable routines. But Clint remained, still sitting in his booth, his back straight, eyes still fixed on the menu he'd already ordered from. She busied herself behind the counter, wiping it down again and again, her mind wandering. She couldn't help but steal glances at him. There was something about him that didn't quite sit right. The longer he sat there, the more she felt like she was missing something. The stillness around him seemed too deliberate. He wasn't like the other people who came in, the ones who were used to this place, who fit into the background without making a ripple. Clint, on the other hand, was the kind of man who made you notice him, even without trying. And then, as if the universe had been waiting for the right moment, the answer clicked into place. Emily was walking past the menu on the wall when her eyes caught something. A name. A small, almost inconspicuous line at the bottom of the menu, owned and operated by Clint Eastwood. Her heart skipped a beat. Her steps faltered as she read the words again, as if her mind had to process it twice to make sense of what she was seeing. Clint Eastwood? She turned toward him, a rush of panic flooding her chest. The man sitting at the booth, the one who she had so carelessly mocked, the one she had assumed was just another grumpy old man, was none other than the Hollywood legend Clint Eastwood. The same Clint Eastwood whose name was synonymous with toughness, grit, and the kind of stoic calm that could bring even the loudest of rooms to a hush. Her mouth went dry, and her pulse quickened. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks, and suddenly, the diner felt much too small, the air too thick. She glanced over at him again, and this time, the small flicker of recognition in his eyes sent a chill down her spine. He hadn't said anything, not a word, and yet there was an unspoken understanding between them. He had been listening all along, watching, waiting. The weight of her earlier words came crashing down on her, each one sharper than the last. Grumpy old man vibe. Most people your age aren't sitting here alone. The snide remarks, the careless jabs. All of it. She felt her stomach tighten. How could she have been so ignorant? So dismissive? And now there he was, not just a customer, not just a man with a weathered face, but a man who owned the very diner she worked in. He wasn't just any old man. He was Clint Eastwood, a name that carried more weight than she could have ever imagined. For a few moments, she just stood there, frozen. She wasn't sure what to do. How could she even begin to apologize? What could she possibly say to someone like him, someone who had seen things, done things, lived a life that she could barely comprehend? Her thoughts raced as she turned toward him. Clint was still sitting there, calm as ever, as if nothing had changed. His eyes were still fixed on her, and though his expression didn't shift, there was a subtle intensity in the air now, something she hadn't noticed before. The silence between them felt heavier than ever. Finally, she found her voice, but it came out in a rush, almost too fast. I didn't know it was you. I'm so sorry, she stammered, the words tumbling over each other. I didn't mean anything by it. It was just a joke. Clint didn't immediately respond. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, unmoving, his gaze steady. The seconds stretched on, each one longer than the last. Emily could feel the heat rise in her cheeks, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had been rude. She had insulted him, a man she now knew to be far more important than she could ever have imagined. And then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. His voice was low, measured, almost like he was choosing his words carefully. "It's all right," he said, his tone not unkind but firm. "But next time, be careful who you judge." The simplicity of his words hit harder than any reprimand could have. It wasn't angry. It wasn't harsh. It was just a fact, a quiet truth that made her feel smaller than anything else could. She nodded, though she wasn't sure what else to say. What could she say? There was no excuse, no way to undo the damage. She had spoken without thinking, had let her own assumptions cloud her judgment. And now Clint Eastwood, the Clint Eastwood, was quietly schooling her on the importance of respect. Not with a lecture, not with anger, but with a calm reminder that sometimes words can carry weight that we don't even realize. As he stood up to leave, Emily felt a strange mixture of relief and regret. He didn't hold it against her. He didn't make a scene. He simply did what he came to do, as if nothing had happened. But the lesson he had imparted on her would stick with her long after he had walked out the door. And as Clint Eastwood made his way to the door, slipping out into the night, Emily was left standing there, feeling as if she had been changed in some small but significant way. It wasn't the first time she'd made a mistake, but this one felt different. This one felt like a lesson she would carry with her, one that might just make her think twice the next time she made assumptions about anyone. The diner had grown quieter by the time Clint Eastwood finished his meal. The last few customers lingered, finishing their coffee, chatting softly among themselves. Emily, however, was far from ready to move on. Her mind replayed the moment over and over, the weight of her own words now sinking in deeper with each passing second. She stood behind the counter, her hands trembling as she wiped it down again and again, though it was spotless. She was caught in the aftermath, trying to reconcile the person she thought she knew with the person she had just insulted. She glanced over at Clint, who hadn't rushed to leave, but now seemed to be gathering his things with quiet purpose. There was no hurry in his actions, no sign of irritation. He wasn't making a scene. He wasn't even looking her way. He simply stood, as composed as ever, as though the incident hadn't affected him in the least. But Emily felt it, the sting, the weight of her foolishness. She had made a joke, sure, but it was one thing to poke fun at a regular who could laugh it off. It was another entirely to mock a man who had the world at his feet and still chose to sit in a quiet diner, unseen by most. She had mistaken his quiet dignity for weakness, and that mistake would haunt her for the rest of the night. The door chimed softly as Clint made his way out. Emily couldn't let it go. She had to say something, anything, to make amends, to show that she understood what had just happened. So, without thinking, she rushed to the door, her feet moving before her mind could catch up. "Mr. Eastwood," she called out, her voice shaking slightly. Clint turned, his eyes meeting hers once more. There was no anger in his gaze, no judgment. Just that quiet, measured calmness that seemed to define him. It was almost as if he had been expecting this. I just wanted to say, I really am sorry," Emily said, her voice more genuine now than it had been all night. "I didn't mean to be rude. I misjudged you, and I realize how wrong that was." Clint looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing her words, before he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Everyone makes mistakes," he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight of wisdom that felt earned through years of experience. "It's not about getting it right all the time. It's about learning from it when you don't." Emily stood there, unsure of what else to say. His words weren't dismissive, but they weren't filled with sympathy either. It was more like he was passing on a quiet lesson, something that required no apology, no grand gestures. Just an acknowledgement that we all fall short sometimes, and that it's the recognition of our mistakes that makes the difference. "I'll do better," she said, her voice steady now, more sure of herself than she had been in the last few hours. Clint didn't respond immediately, but when he spoke, there was a trace of something resembling approval in his voice. "I'm sure you will," he said. "Just keep your eyes open." With that, Clint turned and walked out the door, the bell chiming softly behind him. Emily watched him disappear into the night, the sound of his footsteps fading into the quiet street. She stood there for a long time, the words still echoing in her mind. Keep your eyes open. It wasn't just about seeing people for who they were. It was about seeing them with respect, understanding that appearances could be deceiving. It was about not making assumptions, not based on age, appearance, or background. It was about seeing the humanity in everyone, even in those who seemed the most unremarkable at first glance. The lesson wasn't just for her to learn. It was one she would carry with her, something that would change the way she saw people moving forward. As she turned back into the diner, the silence felt different. The weight of the moment had passed, but something about it had stuck. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was someone who had learned the importance of humility, of seeing beyond the surface, of respecting the people she served. The rest of the night passed by in a blur. She finished her shift, cleaned up, and headed home, but there was a new lightness in her step, a new sense of purpose in her heart. She had made a mistake, yes, but it had turned into something much more meaningful. As Emily lay in bed that night, she thought about Clint Eastwood, the quiet man who had taught her something she would never forget. The lesson had been simple, but it was one that would stay with her for the rest of her life. The diner was empty now, save for a few lingering customers sipping the last of their coffee before heading out. The atmosphere was quiet, almost serene, as the clock ticked away the last few minutes of the night. Emily had finished her shift, cleaning up and resetting the tables, but the air in the diner felt different now. It was as if something had shifted, not just in the diner, but within her. The last few hours had left an imprint, a quiet reminder that life and people are more layered than they often appear at first glance. As she wiped down the counter for what felt like the 100th time, her mind wandered back to Clint Eastwood, his calm demeanor, his quiet wisdom, and the lesson he had unwittingly taught her. Keep your eyes open. It was simple advice, but in its simplicity, there was so much depth. It wasn't just about noticing people. It was about respecting them, seeing beyond the surface, and understanding that everyone had their own story. Emily had always been quick to judge. She'd worked hard to get to where she was, but in the process, she'd built walls around herself, walls that made it easier to dismiss others, to make assumptions about them. And tonight, Clint had broken through those walls with a single look, a few quiet words. He hadn't reacted with anger, nor had he given her a sermon. Instead, he had simply shown her the importance of humility, of seeing people for who they truly were, without the filters of preconceived notions. Her own journey had been one of striving, of fighting for recognition in a world that sometimes felt indifferent. She'd been trying to prove herself, to her boss, to her customers, and even to herself. But Clint had shown her that the true measure of a person wasn't in how loud they spoke or how much they could prove. It was in how they treated others, how they saw the world and the people in it. Clint didn't need to boast about his achievements. He didn't need to draw attention to himself. He simply was. And that was enough. As she closed the diner doors behind her and stepped into the cool night air, the world seemed a little bigger, a little clearer. She felt like she had gained a new perspective, not just on Clint, but on herself. She was still the same person, of course, but now she was a little more aware, a little more conscious of how she interacted with the world around her. And that made all the difference. The next morning, Emily found herself walking into the diner with a renewed sense of purpose. There were still grumpy customers, still spilled coffee, and still long hours ahead, but now she felt ready to face it all with a different mindset. She'd learned not just from Clint, but from the situation itself. The small things mattered. The way you spoke to people, the way you treated them when you thought they weren't looking, the respect you gave them without expecting anything in return. As the day wore on, Emily found herself more patient with the regulars, more thoughtful with her interactions. She no longer felt the need to assert her dominance or make herself the center of attention. She had learned that humility didn't mean weakness, and that real strength came from seeing others for who they were, not who you thought they should be. By the end of her shift, Emily felt a sense of calm she hadn't experienced before. She wasn't just passing through life anymore, reacting to each situation. She was more present, more attuned to the people around her. The walls she had built around herself had started to crumble, and in their place, she was beginning to build something more meaningful, a deeper connection with herself and the world around her. As she locked up the diner that night, she couldn't help but smile. Clint Eastwood had walked into her life for just a few hours, but the impact of his presence had stayed with her. It wasn't the fame, the movies, or the reputation that made Clint special. It was his quiet, unassuming way of being. And in that, There was a lesson Emily would carry with her, day after day. The next time she walked into the diner, or anywhere else for that matter, she would remember. She would remember to keep her eyes open, to treat others with the respect they deserved, and to never forget that there was always more to people than met the eye. The lesson wasn't just for Clint. It was for her, and it was something she would carry with her for the rest of her life.